Welcome to Watercolor 101, my series on what I wish I knew about watercolor before I started painting. In today's video, we will talk about common techniques that would have made watercolor a lot less frustrating had I known them when I first started. Hi, I'm Madeline. I've been painting for a few years now and primarily paint watercolor landscapes and illustrations. But when I first started, I was pretty overwhelmed by all the different watercolor supplies. And at that time, my primary form of learning was through Instagram Reels, which we all know only goes so far. In this video, I'll try to go over some of the more common techniques so that watercolor hopefully feels less intimidating and frustrating for you. I will talk about wet on wet technique and how it differs from wet on dry, the difference between round and mop brushes and how to use them. I'll show you what masking fluid is and why people use it, how to make paint splatters, what it means to lift paint and how this helps portray light, and the biggest question of all, which is how on earth do you paint smooth background washes? And why do our watercolors sometimes get muddy and how do we avoid that? I will try my best to explain these things in an easy to understand manner. This video is meant to be an introduction, so I won't be going super in depth, but stick around for the second part of this series to dive even deeper. If there are questions you have that I didn't answer in this video or that you want to make sure I cover in the next series, drop your questions down in the comments below and I'll make sure to go over them if I read it before filming part 2. I also want to point out that this video does not go over supplies. The video prior to this lesson is all about supplies, so please check that out if you haven't yet. Okay, now that we've got all that covered, let's dive in. The first thing that we're going to be talking about today is what are mop and round brushes and how are they different? So these two brushes are the exact same size. One is a mop brush, which has a fatter and wider belly, and the other is a round brush, which is has a longer and somewhat thinner belly. So I am going to grab Payne's Gray, and I'm just going to make a few brush marks so that you can see the difference. So this is with the mop brush. So with one brush stroke, one pickup of paint, I'm able to get this much color and this much pigment out with just one brush stroke. A round brush of the same size, I'm going to grab the same amount of paint. Is not going to be able to get as much paint on the paper as we did with the mop brush. And another difference is that because the round brush holds a little bit less water and pigment, the brush strokes oftentimes are darker than, say, what we would get with a mop brush. Wet on wet and wet on dry is what it sounds like. Wet on wet is painting wet paint on wet paper or more wet paint, and wet on dry is painting wet paint on either dry paper or dry paint. So I have some paint swatched out right here as a sky, and it's already been dried, and wet on dry would be painting on top of this. So I'll grab a little bit of black and I can paint some birds onto the sky. And my paint is not going to bleed because this is already dry. Wet on dry is good for painting details or illustrations. Wet, on the other hand, is putting wet paint on wet paper and wet paint. Painting a sky. And perhaps dropping in some darker color, which will allow for some bleeding and blending. Wet on Wet allows you to increase the value of the color on the paper, which means to make it darker. And Wet on Wet also allows you to be able to blend more than one color together. So I could add a little bit of pink to the bottom of this. And because everything is still wet, I'm able to really blend it very nicely. The next technique or watercolor technique I want to talk about is masking fluid. Masking fluid is a type of liquid gum or latex that you can paint onto paper and it will preserve the white of the paper. And there are different types of masking fluid. There are really watery types, like this brand. This looks almost like water. The consistency is almost like water. Or you could have thicker masking fluid. And this consistency is almost kind of like cream cheese. The type of masking fluid that you want will depend largely on what you want to do with it. So there are two different ways that you can paint with masking fluid. The first is to use a silicone brush. This has a silicone tip, and so all I have to do is dip the silicone tip into the masking fluid, and then I can paint whatever shapes I want to. I can paint circles, lines, and then once I'm done, I can take my cap, close the bottle, and I can grab a wet wipe and just wipe the masking fluid off of the brush. And it is clean and ready to use again or to be put away. Another way to use masking fluid is with a brush. And so I have a designated brush for masking fluid, and it's this old Princeton Heritage brush that I have. It was, I think, the first brush I ever bought. And so we never want to take a clean or new brush and dip it directly into masking fluid. Doing that will cause your brush to get sort of hardened and you won't be able to use it anymore. But what I like to do is I have a little dish of soap right here. I like to mix my brush into the soap so that it gets really, really nice and soapy. You can even use your fingers to sort of massage the soap so that it's really, really well coated. And then you could use the brush and you could dip it into the masking fluid and maybe paint like leaves or something. So that's another way of using masking fluid. And then once you're done, I would rinse and wash the brush promptly so that it doesn't have time to dry and ruin your brush. So I'm going to go right now and rinse this off in my sink. You can either wait and let your masking fluid dry on its own, or you can use a hot air tool, which I like to do. Once the masking fluid is dry, you can paint over it. You could just use your fingers and you could rub it off. You just want to make sure that the paint is completely dry before rubbing. And there we have the white paper preserved by the masking fluid. And another way, and this is what I recommend, is to buy a glue eraser, and you can then just rub the masking fluid off with the eraser. And there we have the white of the paper preserved. So paint splatters has a lot to do with the type of brush you are using. These brushes are both round sixes. However, one is made from synthetic hair, meaning it's not real animal hair. And this brush on the right is made out of real animal hair. And generally, real animal hair, the reason why artists like to use brushes with real hair is because they're a lot more absorbent than synthetic brushes that are not made without animal hair. That's not always the case. I have found some brands of synthetic brushes that can be very thirsty, but generally speaking, synthetic brushes tend to not be as thirsty as brushes with real animal hair. So the key to splattering, one, is making sure that the paint isn't too creamy. So if I take this round brush and I just go straight into the well and I tap it, nothing is really going to come out. Okay, I got a few drops, but not very much. If I were to tap with my finger, I don't really see much coming out. But if I get a very watery mixture of purple, then I will get slightly more splatters. So that's with the synthetic brush. You always want to use a watery consistency of paint. But in general, if you use a synthetic brush, sometimes you may have to hit the brush against another brush. That is also another way to get the splatters out. Or you can use an animal hair brush, which I have a go-to splatter brush. And so again, I'm getting this watery mixture of purple. And I have my belly of the brush very loaded with paint, and then if I splatter like this, I get very big paint splatters. And so for me, the best way to get paint splatters is to use a brush that is known that either is made out of real animal hair or is known to be pretty thirsty, and you want to use pretty watery paint. You don't want your paint too creamy, and you don't want to use a brush that can't hold much water and paint because it'll make splattering much more difficult. Lifting paint as a technique is when there's paint on your paper and you're either wanting to take away some of the color and creating a lighter value, or you could be completely taking pigment off the paper. So the first example I want to give you is, say, lifting paint for painting clouds. So I have some ultramarine here, and I'm just going to paint a sky. This is wet on dry, but I just want to get some color on here. Okay, so there we have our sky. So if I take a paper towel and I bunch it up and I put it down on the paper, I can lift some of that paint to create a kind of a nice fluffy cloud. Depending on the paint and how staining it is, that sort of determines how much paint you can actually lift off. So if it were like a very highly staining blue or any type of color, then it would be kind of difficult to lift paint with a paper towel. But then there's other colors that lift really well, and if you were to blot it completely, all of it would pretty much come off of the paper. Another technique that I can think of is to portray light. And if I were trying to sort of show that there's maybe light shining through this tree, I could wash my brush and wring it of water so that it's clean and there's no water in it. And I could lift paint like this. I washed my brush again and I dried it off. And this is lifting color with a thirsty brush. And so you can see that where I put my brush stroke, it took some color off of this tree trunk. And so again, I washed my brush and there's no water in it. It's just a thirsty brush and I can pull that color. And that's oftentimes like a way to portray light. You would lift color from either the sky or the trees to try to create that sense of light. The key is to not have like a lot of water in your brush, because once you introduce water into this wet paint, what it can do is pool, and then you get what we call like cauliflower blooms, which we don't want. So this is a clean brush, but there is water in it. And if I drop it in, trying to lift the paint, there ends up being some, let me see if I can focus. I introduced some water to that paper, and when it dries, what it's going to do is cause the water right here to bloom, and we don't want to do that when we're lifting paint. So when lifting paint, you want to make sure that your brush is clean and that it's dry. In order to understand why our colors sometimes get muddy, it's important to look at the color wheel. Colors that are next to each other on the color wheel, when you mix them side by side, they're not likely to get muddy. But if you were to mix colors opposite each other on the color wheel, then there's a higher likelihood of getting muddy colors. And so when we do our background washes or when we're doing any mixing or blending, we have to remember the colors on the color wheel and how they relate to each other. So let's take blue and purple, for example. I'm going to swatch out some blue, and I'm going to grab some purple and swatch it right next to the blue. And because these colors are next to each other on the color wheel, you see the blue and the purple mixing, and there isn't a third color like a brown or a gray. You see the blue, you see the purple, and you see where those two colors blend. But let's say you take green and if you swatch that next to red, the green and the red are not going to mix well. You're going to see a third color, which is this kind of like brownish, muddy color between the green and the red. And that is sort of a very simple way to understand why our colors can sometimes turn brown or gray. When I first started watercolor, I sort of like drove myself crazy thinking oh my gosh, is it because this has like a blue undertone, or is this one warm and that one cool? Is that why my colors are sort of getting brown and gray? But on a very basic level, just looking at the color wheel and looking at which colors are next to each other and which colors are opposite each other, that's a really good, simple way to think about your color mixing. So you can see in these examples, the purple and the blue and the purple and the pink, you don't see any brown or gray. Those colors mix well next to each other because they are next to each other on the color wheel. But the red and the green and the purple and the yellow, you are seeing some muddying colors because those colors are opposite on the color wheel. As we get into how to paint soft background washes with more than one color without muddying our colors, one question that I get asked all the time is, how much water do I need on my paper to do a wet on wet background wash? So I have my 100% cotton paper taped down to this plastic board right here, and I'm going to grab a flat brush and I'm going to show you how much water I put on the paper when I'm doing a background layer. So I generally like to go over the paper entirely about 2 to 3 times. So that's about 1.5 or 2. And then this is the third. And so I want to try to evenly distribute the water. And so if you can see, my paper is glistening, but there isn't like a pool of water anywhere. And the corners tend to dry out the quickest, so make sure that when you're going over the paper with your flat brush to really get the corner and the edges. So now I'm going to grab a mop brush and I'm going to paint a sky using 3 different colors. I'm going to use ultramarine, opera rose, and yellow ochre. So I'm going to start out with some ultramarine right here. And this is pretty bright, and so I can sort of keep moving some of the color around to sort of get it a little bit softer. Yellow and blue together is going to create a green. So when I'm adding the yellow, I want to be careful not to put it on top of the blue. So here is a little bit of yellow ochre. I'm going to dilute it with a little bit more water. And I'm just going to drop in some right here and right here. And then now I'm going to grab some opera rose. And opera rose mixes really well with ultramarine blue into like a really nice purple. So I don't have to worry about those 2 colors mixing. So I like that. And I'm going to use my hot air tool and I'm going to dry it. And so now we have this sky that is a really good mix of blue, pink, and yellow. There are no muddying of colors in our sky, and these 3 colors sort of all melt together. There are no hard lines or edges, and the key to creating a wash like this is to use wet on wet technique and to be mindful of which colors can mix with each other without creating a brown or a gray. And so to just finish this sky off, I'm gonna grab a really light mixture of Payne's Gray, and I'm just gonna add some birds, and that's it for this piece.
You always want to take the paint, you always want to make sure the watercolor is completely dry before peeling the tape so that you don't rip your paper. And so there is our really nice and soft blended sky.
This was something that I really struggled with when I first started watercolor, and I primarily at that time would pick up color straight from the pan or the tube, and I just had a really difficult time getting lighter, more pastel, or even muted colors. Everything just felt very vibrant and very bright. So I'm just going to give you an example. This purple right here is a very, very bright purple. And one way to sort of tone that color down is to dip your brush into the water just once and then sort of lean it up towards the edge and sort of wring it out of any excess water so that when your brush hits the paper, it's not going to be a huge drop of water. This is one way to lighten the value of one of your paints. And so that is a little bit lighter than my first stroke. And we can do that again. Just wash, dip it in, and then sort of take that excess water out. And then this is going to be even lighter. And that's one way to get lighter, more pastel colors and still have the transparency of watercolor rather than, say, adding white gouache or a color like Chinese white to your watercolors to try to get it to look more soft and more pastel-like. Another option you could go with is to actually mix it out on your palette. And straight from the well or the, straight from the well or straight from the pan, the color is pretty bright. And if I wanted to get it lighter, what I could do is just put some of that paint on the palette, grab a little bit of water with my brush, and dilute it even more. And then we can get a lighter value of blue. And what you want to remember or be careful of when you are mixing on the palette, so say I add some of this darker color, and if I come in with my brush and it's loaded with water and I just merely dab it, I don't know if you can tell, but the water really hasn't mixed with all the pigment. And so if I were to paint with that, I would get like a lot of water in my brush that I don't necessarily want. And so you want to really, really mix it up when you add water to the palette to sort of dilute that color without sort of getting like a super watery brush mark that maybe ends up being a little bit, how do I say it? It sort of ends up like getting like a water bloom, I guess is how I would describe it. It just ends up having too much water. The last thing I want to go over in this video is white gouache, and this isn't necessarily a technique, but people do use white gouache as highlights, and that is something that is often used in watercolor. So what gouache is like watercolor in that it is water soluble, but it is unlike watercolor in that it is opaque and not transparent. And gouache oftentimes can be used similar to acrylic paint, but because it's water soluble, it's a little bit easier to clean and a little bit easier to activate. So a lot of times artists will finish their painting and then do some last minute white gouache details. So on this sky that I have painted right here, I've already finished it. It's dry, and I can take my white gouache and I can paint like a little moon right here. And maybe a few stars. So that is something that is oftentimes used with watercolor, along with watercolor. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit subscribe, and if you like my content, please check me out on Patreon.